That means we're officially started.
All right.
All right. So something that's really particular about St. Andrew's that you won't find any other congregation is what all we provide as part of the memorial services. One of the big one, of course, is our help team that is part of that. And Heidi Martinez is the one who leads that ministry.
Marilyn, you're kind of transitioning out, right, Marilyn?
Mhm.
But Marilyn did for many, many years.
Yes, many years. Thank you, Marilyn. And that's a huge thing for families that they don't have to worry about a reception or providing all that at their homes and having a space in particular where this can happen. And it doesn't cost anything. It's what we provide. And so, it's listed up there. Our refreshments typically include those little finger sandwiches, fruit and vegetables and dip and cookies and lemonade, and coffee and water. Those food items are provided by our volunteers. So the call goes out from Heidi to the teams to bring in those cookies or fruit or vegetables. Or there's little sandwiches depending on what the families have requested. And then it's brought into the office or into the kitchen here throughout that week prior to that memorial service reception. With that as well, those hosts that are part of that help team set up all the tables and centerpieces, if there are any, get this room set up for that reception the day of. And I also want to recognize many of you are part of that, have been part, if not all of you, of that help team. And so you know it as well or better than I do because you've done it. I've just been here to observe it happening. So, yeah, and that's a huge, huge thing that we get to provide. And it's actually kind of falls into what my sermon message is about too. The generosity of this congregation and how the many ways that we get to serve others in this way. So you want to say more?
Well, I'm going to go backwards and just do like a word of introduction about what we're going to cover. So, we, depending on if you've ever been a part of having to plan a funeral for someone or with someone, there's about 1,000 decisions that feel like they have to get made. Would it help you all if I spoke in the microphone, or are you okay? Okay. So that you feel like there's about 1,000 decisions that you have to make, and that can feel very overwhelming on a good day. But if you're having a day when you're feeling a lot of grief, it can be almost impossible to make a decision. So, like I said, if any of you have ever been involved with planning a service for someone, you probably are familiar with the range of emotions that people experience. So really, when we are working with families or individuals to plan a memorial service or a funeral or a celebration of life, there's lots of different language that can be used. One of our biggest hopes is that we can make it a meaningful process that help people along as they're journeying through this experience of grief. And I put this help ministry reception slide first because Pastor Manuel shared the story of his own experience of going to his home congregation in Stockton. Yeah, and I was going to ask you to share, and having it was like going through the experience of planning his mother's service at a different location made him realize what's pretty special and important about our ministry at the end of life and around times of funerals and memorial services, and why that's such an important part of that we see this as a ministry of our congregation. So if you want to share that story, would that be good?
Yeah. So it's my home congregation. I grew up in First Baptist Church in Stockton. I spent 20 years there. I was there the first weekend after I was born and raised through there. My mother served on church council in the late 80s, early 90s there. And I served on the council as a council education representative when I was a teenager as well. I was the youngest ever to be on that council. So anyway, I spent a lot of time there. And so when I called, because my mother had passed away, we had been not part of that church for several years because my mom and my dad had moved up to Rockland, which was about 45 minutes to an hour away from Stockton. So my mom was worshiping at a church up there. So when I called after my mom passed away, and I talked to the secretary, and then she called me back after talking to the senior pastor who I know because he came while I was a late teenager to that congregation as an associate pastor. So we know each other. And they called me back and said, well, it'll be, if you need the sanctuary, it's going to be about $2,500. So, and then it'll be another 500 for the tech person. And depending on what music you want, we'll have to figure that out. And so I called back and said, what is wrong with you people? Like, this is a service to the community. How can you charge for this? Do you think you guys really do that good of work that you can rate that high on it? So anyway, there was a little back and forth between the senior pastor and I, and we ended up having the service there, and included a reception too, but we had to provide the food for that reception. They weren't going to do that. So
Did you have to pay?
no, I think I think it was like $500 that we ended up paying for a musician and for a tech person to run the sound. So
I think,
yeah.
wasn't it, there was a whole sheet of, here's all the costs that it'll be.
Oh yeah, they broke it all
Yeah,
down.
it wasn't just for the sanctuary, it was like, then this much for a sound tech, and then this much for a
Right.
musician, and then this much, right? And so, I think Pastor Manuel shared more than once how eye-opening of an experience that was to come back and say, okay, for us at St. Andrews to recognize that this is one of a very tender time in a person's life when we're experiencing grief and loss. And so we want to make sure that ministering to people in periods like that is something that we really prioritize as a spiritual support to people. Yeah. So I feel that one of the hugest gifts St. Andrews has that is somewhat unique to St. Andrews is our help ministry. And, our help ministry doesn't only just provide that hospitality for reception time, but also has provided other kind of support for people in times of crisis for other reasons too, outside of memorial services and funerals and times of grieving. Yeah.
Story about.
Yes.
So it's not a section. They didn't know about it.
Yeah.
Well, those of us that loved her wanted our own reception so we could gather together. Well, at the end of the service, Pastor Manning says, oh, and we're having a little reception, maybe community center, and y'all are welcome. Well, I ran this Elvis and the reception one too. And anyway, and they said how wonderful it was if they heard stories about their mom that they didn't know. And they were so appreciative. So it worked out. It's awesome.
Worked out the way it was supposed to. With a little help from Lydia. Yeah. So so again, when we're planning a memorial service, it's really those stories that get shared, right? These words of promise that we hear about God's love for us in all circumstances of our life. That stuff is important, regardless of a person's relationship with the congregation or with the church, or I personally feel like funerals and memorial services are some of the most meaningful things we get to do with and for people. And so planning the service itself, if you are thinking about making decisions in advance for what you think you would like at your service, that can also be a huge gift to your loved ones who are trying to put this together, because then they feel like they know how they can honor you. They know what you would like. Right. So I want to make sure you think of this time as a resource, not only for if you're doing this as a part of a family for someone who has died, but if you want to do advanced planning on your own, and make some notes somewhere, or tell someone in your life, here's the notes that I've made or the requests that I have for my service. so that they know where to find that information. It can be a really meaningful thing too. You don't have to do that, but if it's something that is important to you, I would encourage you to think through some of that as we're kind of going over funeral planning information for us here at St. Andrews. Like I said, if you plan a funeral in a different place or not at a church, things might be a little bit different. But in general, most of this information, part of it is unique to us. And then a lot of it is just knowing, when you're not in the midst of the cloud of grief, kind of what's involved. So that's some of our goals. Yeah, so our help ministry is an amazing thing. And for those of you who have been volunteers, it's meaningful to be a part of providing this for people as well, even if you don't know them. Yes, Sarah. Yeah, do you want to fill us in on I was going to put that in there, but.
Embrace, love, and provide.
Oh, okay.
Help, embrace. It used to be called something else. Yeah.
EAT. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it used to be the EAT ministry.
Oh, that's right.
Eat. Yeah, help is good. And that was all under Marilyn's guidance that we kind of revised a little bit about how our help ministry functions here. So the other thing, is when we welcome new members, we automatically get them involved in the help ministry, because not only is that a meaningful way to contribute to our life here, but at the same time, it's a way for them to get to be involved in serving others. And it's an easy way to get involved in service, which is a huge part of what we think is important in our lives as Christians, right? So are there any questions or other thoughts or stories about our help ministry and the reception time? Yeah, Marilyn.
I believe that we had a form that we could ask for that would guide us in future planning.
Yes.
Mhm.
For service.
We do have those, and if you want them, we can provide them for you. Yeah. We didn't bring, I think, Pastor Ray, it's up there if that's what you're looking for.
Oh, yeah.
We didn't necessarily bring those with us today, but we do have, so what we do typically have is a worksheet that we would go over with someone in planning a memorial service. All that information is in our slideshow, but if you want to take a hard copy of the worksheet home with you, you are more than welcome to take one of those today. And we can provide, or any other day, we can provide that for you. But it's a pretty simple thing. And like I said, we're going to go over everything that's in that planning sheet through our PowerPoint presentation. So you can take notes if you want to, or if you prefer to just take a copy of that document home with you, we can provide that for you as well, pretty quickly. And yes, or we can email them to you. Yeah, definitely. We want to make sure if that's something you want to take with you that you have access to pretty easily. But the help part is not in that worksheet. So that's why I want to make sure to highlight that part of our work together. It's like, there's a simple question on the worksheet that's like reception ? Well, there's a lot more to just saying yes, to that. Okay, so any other any other stories or anything about our help ministry? Have any of you had experiences being a part of a help team before? Yeah.
It's very rewarding.
It is very rewarding, and I completely agree. And when we're in meetings with folks and we say to them, we will provide the reception for you, we'll provide the hospitality, we will serve the food, we will do the dishes. I mean, that just can be such an overwhelming gift in a good way. Mm. And it makes people feel so cared for. And the idea that they just get to be present, which is hard enough when you're grieving, but just get to be present with these folks who also loved your loved one and share those stories without worrying about the details of, is there enough food? Like, do I need to refill the coffee? Truly, those little things are huge things for someone on a day like that. Yeah. Yeah.
We had both worked at San Diego State, and many of these comments had done. And afterwards, they were telling me what a wonderful reception and how engaged they were, and they had never experienced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's like I said, it's something that I just love about our ministry here. And I hope it's something that we continue to be involved with, because it's just so important. I mean, and we do services for people that either have no connection to us or kind of a minimal connection to us. And we don't ask those kinds of questions. We don't say, oh, you have to be a member here, otherwise it costs you, right? Like, that's not how we view it. We view it as a ministry. We're sharing God's love this way through feeding people in times of grief. That's very biblical in my mind. Yeah, Sarah.
My boss's wife's mother had died. And she was a Lutheran from the Midwest. And they were not church.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I can't imagine a situation where we would say no to a memorial service unless there was some extenuating circumstance that made that not possible. But when I was in seminary, maybe you had the same class, but one of my professors said to me, you don't have to say yes to every wedding that you're asked to do, but unless it's really, unless there's extenuating circumstances, say yes to funerals whenever you can, because that is a time where we need to share the gospel with people. So, and that is a time where people need to know that they are loved and cared for, even if it's by people they don't know. Right. So, I think the help ministry and our reception time is really an example of sharing God's love in a very tangible way. So that's why I want to lift that one up first, because I just think it's so important. So
the other piece of it, I mean, recently we had a family who most of the family was in Germany.
Oh, right.
And making all those plans. And when they found out, they were just so thankful that things were already in place, and their mother hadn't been here for many years, was a member here in the past, but hadn't been here. And so just so thankful that across the ocean, they didn't have to worry about that. The other piece of it is, thinking about what we don't charge. When funeral homes charge an exorbitant amount, and it's so expensive to die and get buried. There's so much money involved. The thing that we get to say, don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. It's huge. It's a huge gift to the families.
Is there a standard fee for the pastors to preside over it?
No, I mean, we'll go over, we have a slide about the fees and costs and things.
Mm-hmm.
No, for members of St. Andrews in particular, we don't have any expectation of that. I always say, I don't know what you say. We always say, if you want to give a gift to the pastors, you can, but you don't have to. It's a part of our job here. So we do have standard fees if we were to provide for a service that's not a ministry of St. Andrews. Like if a funeral home were to call me up and say, can you come do this service, then there's a fee that's usually charged with that, that's given to us. But anytime it's an extension of our ministry here, that's what I think is my job.
And talking, and talking to our colleagues or other pastors, we're lowballers. Like we're way cheap. And that, I kind of inherited that from Andy. We haven't increased those fees. It's just, this is what we do, so.
All right, well, let's go to our next slide. So some decisions that typically, so additional services that we provide at no cost, free use of the sanctuary. We also have guest books for people if they need those, just a very simple, nice guest book.
And those are actually purchased by the Stephen ministers.
Yeah, the Stephen ministers cover the cost of that. Oh, is it the
teenagers? Okay, you guys do the Christ in our homes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And then we also provide bulletin printing services, right? So you will typically work with Paula to create a bulletin and have those prepared and printed here.
And we have the bulletin covers. We have regular bulletin covers that have a nice little scene that's kind of out of focus and says something about God or country or something. But we can also do now, because we have a color printer, we can take the image of the person. Typically what we've done is there's like a picture that goes up near the altar of the loved one. We'll take that image and put that on the bulletin cover and can print that, and that we don't charge extra for that with our color print.
And we'll go more into detail about that on a future slide. We also provide access to tables and other items to display pictures, personal items, flowers, etc. Right? So we provide all of those things for someone planning a service here. So if you want a table up front with something personal, like a baseball glove and like a picture or whatever, right? We make sure that a family can have whatever representation of their loved ones they want, either in the worship space or in the reception space. And again, so if that's something where you're like, at my funeral, I want my, I don't know, military uniform displayed or something, you can make notes like that for your loved one and let them know if that's a request that you have, or something like that. And again, any decision that a grieving person doesn't have to make is helpful to them, I feel, most of the time. So those are the services that we kind of provide as just a part of our ministry. So then we also will work to coordinate music. Right now, Scott does an incredible job of when we'll say there's a funeral tomorrow. Scott shows up and and plays the music or helps coordinate solos or things like that. We do recommend payment for musicians. Just again, oftentimes funerals are on short notice. And so to make sure musicians and soloists are being taken care of is a kind thing to do. So we often do that. We'll, like I said, have conversation with folks for support in planning the services and then providing that pastoral presence as well. So those are all things we offer. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the decisions that typically go into planning a service itself. So first of all, something that can be a big deal is who is the family contact or contacts for a memorial service planning. So I'll share my own story of this. So I think you guys all know my grandmother passed away earlier this spring. My dad was very much involved of taking care of her at the end of her life, but he was not very involved in the planning of the memorial service. One of my uncles took that on. And so he works at a church office, kind of like a Mary Jo type person in his congregation in Omaha. So before she had even passed away, he had a bulletin ready, right? He had assigned parts, he had done all these things, all that stuff, all those decisions were made. Now, my uncle's approach was to not ask, but just tell, right? Which kind of got on my nerves a little bit, I'll be totally honest. He didn't ask me, because I was supposed to preside at that service. He didn't ask me when I was available. They set a date and told me those kinds of things. I would recommend, if you are a decision maker for a family person or a loved one, that you approach with recognizing someone has to be a decision maker, but getting input from the family most of the time is a good idea. I'm just gonna say that. But someone does have to be the decision maker. And it helps us in the church office, or if you're dealing with a funeral home or another place, it helps for there to be one contact person making decisions. We've had experiences where that's been unclear in a family, and we'll have 3 people telling us 7 different ideas about one thing, right? And so part of what especially Paula ends up doing a lot is trying to get consensus from people. So it's very helpful if you have 1 or 2 folks that can kind of do that consensus work behind the scenes. And then when we're making decisions about the day itself, they're just the communicators of that or the decision makers. Does that make sense?
It reminds me too that funerals and weddings are the times when all the dysfunction and drama comes out in the family.
It can be.
Yeah. And sometimes it comes out in a very ugly way. And so the decision making, sometimes that passive stuff, that aggressiveness that people do, they're not going to communicate with the other family member. And so then it has to go through the pastors or Paula to communicate between the family members, because they don't want to talk to each other. So yeah. It's not good for any of us for that. So
yeah. And so on our form, the first question is contact person. So again, there are some people who are, if we're thinking about Marys and Marthas in our lives, right? There are some Marthas who want to be the person to do all the things that need to get done. And sometimes that Martha person can be annoyed with the Mary type people who seem to be just present in the moment, unaware of all the work going behind the scenes, all that kind of stuff. you know, but we just want to make sure that we are doing our due diligence as people trying to put together the most meaningful service we can to communicate as best we can, and then try to establish that rapport with families and loved ones. Again, for if you all are making notes thinking about your own service, that can be a huge help. It can be such a sweet thing, especially when we have known the people, when a loved one comes in with a handwritten letter or note from the person who's died saying, here's what I hope happens as a part of my memorial service. That is like a treasure, you know, that is like a treasure. It's so sweet, and wonderful when a family member gets to feel like their loved one has thought ahead about these kinds of things. You know what I mean?
What's not helpful
Yeah.
is when the loved one says, I don't want anything.
Yeah.
Well, it's not for you. It's for the ones that are left behind. So
We have had that happen a few times, and I know it's been hard for us here at church, where we have a beloved person who's passed away and said, I don't want a memorial service. Wilma Springer was one of those recently. Grace Walk was one of those. We still haven't had a service for Eileen DeLorean, right? And that can be challenging when either the person themselves said, don't do a service for me for whatever reason, or when the family has said, you know, we're not going to do that for whatever reason. I think, I think funerals are very important, myself. Yeah. So I would encourage you, if you're in your own state of mind thinking, well, I don't want them to do something like this for me after I've gone. It can be very hard for a family to say, well, my grandma didn't want a service, but we want one. Are we going to be like doing something wrong if we don't honor her wishes? You know? So just some things to think through and talk about with your loved ones ahead of time. So that's communicated as much as it can be. But we often, like I said, the first line on our form is contact persons. And that's because, again, we're trying to prevent confusion and make sure we're doing the best we can to put a meaningful service together. So who will be the contacts? Date, place, and time of service. That seems obvious enough, but sometimes that can be complicated making those decisions. And there can have to be a little back and forth to figure that out. But that is, you know, again, step one, when is it going to be, what time, and where? And that's a part of our form that we make sure is clear. And then will there be a reception following the service or not? Again, that's that little like yes or no. Seems like a simple enough decision. But that's why we want to highlight what involves in going into a reception. And then, like Pastor Manuel was saying, what type of bulletin? We have some really beautiful pre-printed covers that are, you know, have images that we try to select, or verses or words that fit with something that person cared about. You know, someone will come to us and say, well, they love the color purple. So then we try to find a funeral bulletin cover that has a purple flower or something on it. Or they were in the military, so then we have a few that have kind of American flag themed military covers. So you can do those pre-printed ones, or like Pastor Manuel said, now we have the ability to in-house do an image of someone on the front or back or somewhere in the bulletin. So there's a couple different styles of bulletins. Again, there's really no wrong decision about what kind of bulletin you're going to have. You know, it varies how much people care about that, but it is a decision that does need to get made somehow, right? Okay, so if you have time to find a place to jot down your favorite hymns or music, that is a really special way to honor someone's memory. Because part of what we walk through with folks is, what congregational hymns would you like? Is there pre-recorded music you would like? Is there a soloist or an ensemble or special music of some kind that you want to sing? That is oftentimes a very emotional part for us, right? Singing these hymns or hearing these songs. And again, it helps our musicians to be able to prepare to do that well. I mean, again, something that a recent experience of this was Max Pearson had asked Chris Stevens, and I think Scott was a part of that as well, to do the Lord's Prayer at Paul's memorial service. If you were there, there was not a dry eye in the house when he sang that Malott version of the Lord's Prayer. And the choir had come up early for communion, I think, and so the choir ended up kind of being in the front for that. And it was a very sacred moment, I think, for all of us that were kind kind of gathered and recognized, like everything else just seemed to pause. And it was very meaningful for the family. So that music can be a very important thing, part of the service.
Yeah, and I, put a lot of thought into that music, and we have a lot of gifted musicians. It's not just Scott, there are others, but he's wonderful, can do anything. I have a lot of trouble with pre-recorded music in the services because it really just takes out the spirit in it. That canned music just doesn't work well. And then often the family doesn't know what the song's really about. They just like, this song sounds like reminds me of my loved one, and I'd like it played there. And it's like Living on a Prayer by Bon Jovi or something, and it doesn't fit at all. But and it really does suck the air out of the room. So I have
You heard it here first, everyone.
I have opinions. So keep that in mind. It doesn't have to be a hymn. It can be a secular song, but think about what the words are in those songs before you request that song.
Yes.
It can be played at the reception. Yeah, that actually might be more appropriate for some people. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah. And we've used Bob Jasik's work before too. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's good. So, but that's thoughtful. I mean,
If you don't have to.
yeah. And yeah, exactly.
Another big decision that can sometimes feel hard, sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not, is who will give a eulogy or eulogies. So sometimes there are folks that feel equipped to do that. And sometimes you go, someone's going to say, there's no way I could get up there and talk. And that's okay too. Okay. And here we kind of have two different ways that we come at telling the story of a person's life. So we do typically ask for a copy of a write-up of a person's life, whether you call that an obituary or whatever. Now, more and more, the expenses of publishing an obituary have gotten higher and higher. And has anyone gone through that recently where you're trying to put yes? So if you try to put an obituary, like, back, and I'm sure there's always been costs associated with it, but, oftentimes that section of the newspaper where you would read through, people have died and their obituaries and all that. Now it's sometimes prohibitive, the expense. And so people will not publish an obituary. But the other thing that's becoming more and more common is that funeral homes will provide a website, right? So on their website, they'll have a section of people who have recently died that they've been, working through that process with families. And there'll be an online obituary that you can, most of the time it's a minimal fee or sometimes even free, that you can share. And so figuring out who's going to write that obituary up, and then making sure that we see it, because typically one of the pastors will read the obituary or the write-up in the service. That's different than the eulogy. And so, and like I said, this isn't done everywhere, but it is a part of our process here at St. Andrews, that one of the pastors will read that on behalf of the family. The eulogy is not meant to be the obituary or write-up of a person's life. It may include highlights of that oftentimes, but the kind of facts of a person's life is not the same as their life story. And so the hope, and there's a slide in a little bit, Larry sent a really great resource about how to write a meaningful eulogy. And we'll show you that in a minute.
It reminds me too, one of the things that the funeral homes are now providing are the slideshows.
Oh yeah.
They'll produce those slideshows for you. You just give them the images and they'll put it all together. And we've used them in here as part of the reception. And it's a nice thing to have, and often includes music as well without words.
Yeah. So sometimes we'll have one eulogy, we'll have 2 or 3 eulogies. It kind of depends on the family.
And some families don't want any eulogy at all.
Yeah.
They don't want their loved one eulogized in the service. They don't want to get that personal, or they really didn't like the loved one that much. I'm joking. That's never happened. Really? Well, that's a different case where, yeah, there are cases where they'll say, I'm gonna have a written eulogy and my brother's gonna do one, but we don't want anybody else to share because we know what our parent was really like and we don't want to hear those stories. So they want to shut it down. So that's all within the range of possibilities.
Yes, there'll be another slide going more into detail about it. But it is something to think about. And then, will there kind of hand in hand with that is, will there be a time of remembrance? That's that open mic time where we kind of go around and let people share a word or a few words or a memory or a story in the room. And that really varies from family to family. It's a totally optional thing. You don't have to do it if no one has anything nice to say. I feel like that's what you're, but it's something some people really want that. And it can be a very nice thing. Again, if you have someone who you're bringing different communities together, someone's friends, someone's work colleagues, someone's church friends, to get to hear the different ways that people, that this person meant to them. Here, if you can go back.
Oh,
I'm not ready yet.
I don't know if I can go back. Oh, look, I can go back.
Well, then another thing that can be really meaningful is if you're planning or thinking in advance for your own service, Bible verses or other readings you would like included and who will read them. Oftentimes we will choose like the gospel reading for a memorial service because that's what we prepare a sermon or a homily or a message based off of, but we don't have to. If there's pre-selected Bible passages, that can actually tell us a lot about a person and their faith and some of their spirituality, which is really great. I love knowing people's favorite Bible verses or favorite Bible stories. And it's a really, really nice thing to include. So if you have some favorites, you can do that. Other people have like brought in their loved ones' Bibles. You like flip through and see what's been underlined and highlighted. And to be able to come to a service and say, we found this, we know that this person had written notes about this Bible verse. It's like, that's like it's very personal. And that can be really a wonderful thing. And maybe a chance to learn more about your loved one, even though they have died. I mean, their stories, their memories are still here, right? We can still learn from them. And so something to think about, are there Bible verses you really love? There are kind of some standards, both with hymns and Bible verses for memorial services. It's not a coincidence. You'll hear a lot of the same music or a lot of the same verses. And that's because there are certain verses like Psalm 23 or Amazing Grace as a hymn that really do speak into that time and are familiar with a broad range of people. And it's okay to not have a lot of Bible knowledge. I don't ever want someone to worry about that. But when we start reading the words of Psalm 23, people will go, oh, it'll hit them, right? Oh, I know these words and they're words of comfort. And that's what I need right now. So something to think about, or if there's other readings too, if there's other stuff people want included, and who will read them. I mean, the Bible verses can be a nice way to include people in a service who maybe don't feel comfortable getting up and talking, but they can read a Bible verse. So that's some things to think about. Does anyone have any stories or reactions to any of that? Yeah, Sarah. Yeah. Yes.
Over the rainbow, yeah. Yeah, it was really sweet.
Kimberly Mahoney. So any other questions about that part? Okay, so now we'll get into eulogies. This is an article, and I don't, you maybe want to take a picture of that, or we can email it out to you all. Yeah, there's also, it's really neat. It's from a doctor who is pretty well known person who has specialized in hospice and palliative care. He's a doctor, and he's kind of co-written this article that it's like a how-to put a eulogy together. And then at the bottom is a TED talk of his talking about the end of life from a doctor's perspective. It's worth watching. It's like 18 minutes, but it's worth watching and thinking about. And I think sometimes in that talk gets you to step back and maybe think about things that oftentimes we maybe take for granted about end of life and those kinds of things. But this is a great resource that Larry found that he passed on, how to give a eulogy that truly celebrates the person you are honoring. Having a little bit of guidance is a great thing. You know, we can also read through things in advance or talk through things with you all, you know, but the most important part of a eulogy is just that it's, you know, there's a genuineness that comes across. You just want to mean what you're saying, right? As much as you can. So keeping it brief, 5 to 10 minutes is fantastic. We've had eulogies sometimes go 20 to 30 minutes. If you are,
And they were written.
yeah.
It wasn't just off the cuff.
And if you are on one of our help teams, you know that there have been times when we've darted over here to say 30 more minutes or whatever, right? Because that time of remembrance maybe has gone longer than we anticipated. But yeah, if you want to go ahead. That second bullet point is Pastor Manuel's.
The second one?
Yeah, it's important. to have
Oh,
those.
yeah.
Yeah.
It is, because, you know, in your time of grief, sometimes people will go on and on. I've had people who end up, instead of talking about their loved one, they start talking about themselves the whole time. And so that's one of having it written. Hopefully they pick up on it if they've written it down that, oh, all I'm doing is talk about myself. The other part that I often tell people is just to get them started thinking about it. If your loved one was applying for a job, how would you write up their resume? You know, it's not real personal yet, but it kind of it's a good place to start thinking about it in that. So, and then it's really important to show, and it's in that TED Talk, it's really important to share those personal stories. That's really what people really need to hear and what you need to express as part of your grief as well, those personal stories. And just as we say in the services here, you know, if you don't have it in you to get up and speak to the group that's gathered in that sanctuary, share at your table in the reception, those stories. The family really needs to hear those stories. So.
Or if you want to write it up and you realize I can't get up there and say it, there are other people who can read it for you. A pastor or someone like that can read it for you. Totally fine with doing that, right? So, I mean, any other questions or thoughts about that eulogy part? Again, you don't have to even do one if you don't want to, but it's a nice thing to have involved. With Paul Pearson's again, you know, Paul and Max, they moved here rather later in life, and they had a whole rich life in New Jersey that they talk about sometimes. And then it was like, as these family members and friends started telling stories about Paul, it was like, I didn't know about that. I didn't know about that, you know, and it just kind of made you love him all the more. When you realized all of this parts of his life that, you know, made him the person he was that we knew in the time that we've known him here in the last 10 years or so, right? So that was really, you know, it's a moment where you realize and I know this is always true, right? You don't know like a person's background all the time that makes them the person that they are. And when you get to know these parts of them, it's so meaningful, right? So, yeah.
We just have 3 more slides.
Oh, okay.
I wanted to share that.
Oh, yeah.
At my son's grandmother, her funeral, he was a pallbearer, and he was 18, 19 in there. And it came time for people to share memories. And he said, I keep my peanut butter in the refrigerator because grandma did.
Oh,
And that's all he said.
His grandma, I keep my peanut butter in the refrigerator because grandma did. That is so sweet. Okay, so then we will always ask the families this question. There's a line on our form that says, in lieu of flowers, okay? So, you know, anymore, it is unusual to get those, like, just delivery upon delivery of flowers. There's often some flower arrangements. A newer thing that people have been doing more and more here is like just paying for our weekend flower arrangements to be the service flowers and then keep them here honoring that person through the weekend, you know, whatever. So flowers can be a thing. And I don't have strong opinions about that. But Oftentimes a family will want to honor a loved one rather than having people have the expense of sending floral arrangements and things like that. They'll oftentimes do this. In lieu of flowers, donations can be made too. And there's lots of different ways you can do that. We have memorial funds here, right, that are in someone's name. And one of my favorite examples of this recently is Joyce Butte, right? Joyce Butte passed away. Her family wanted a memorial fund established here in her memory. People gave to it. And that money, we ended up coming back to her family and saying, you know, this money's been sitting here for a little bit. Could we use this money to help sponsor the cost of our mural in our preschool? And it'll be in her memory then. And that was a perfect thing to do to remember Joyce Butte. Some people will have a specific way they want gifts designated. Like Pastor Manuel's mom has a memorial fund here, and she was a musician. So it's for our music ministry. It hasn't been spent necessarily yet, but those funds are often designated in a certain way. As much information as the church has as possible is helpful to us. When we just get a memorial fund and we don't really know where it's supposed to go, we're in the process of reestablishing that team, that memorial fund team of volunteers who will contact folks. And this is there's been different ways of doing this in my time here at St. Andrews. I'm sure many more that precede me, to make sure we're communicating well with families to say, here's an ongoing way this person's memory is going to be honored through those gifts. We have our endowment fund. It's a little bit different. When you give to the endowment fund, we grow the endowment part, and then a certain percentage of that, the returns on our endowment get distributed to organizations. And so a gift to an endowment fund doesn't typically have a designated outcome for it. It's just recognizing we're giving to the endowment. The endowment then does good in the world through the gifts and grants that are distributed through our endowment ministry, or another outside organization that's important to your loved ones. So Alzheimer's, cancer research, anything. It can be anything. They volunteered at the zoo, then you can give it to St. Andrews and for this person, then we send all that money on to the zoo, right? Or whatever it is. Or you can give directly to that organization. It doesn't have to come through us. There's different ways to do it. Is there more you want to say about that? Any other questions about that part? You can also not do this part, but most of the time, people will do this whether or not you direct it. We will be working with a family who doesn't give a direction about gifts, and we'll still get gifts that come in. And so we'll still establish a memorial fund for that person, or things like that. And so what's the hope is that those memorial funds are for a special project that somehow is a connection to that person. Who's the person that gave our technology? Bev Smith?
Yes.
Bev Smith used to work in our office, and then her family gave a nice gift to the congregation for her memorial fund, and we use that because of her work in the office. We have used that to be able to replenish computers or any sort of technology and stuff that we
And her
need.
husband's computer work too.
Yeah, and her
He was
husband.
computer programming.
And so that's really nice, it's a very thoughtful thing, and it allows ministry to happen again in that person's memory. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Kathy Hall, who's LaVon Blake's daughter, wanted to do something significant, give a significant gift to the church. And that was the one where she had the idea. She said, we would like to do this in the sanctuary. And we did not know how much we needed those until we had them. Does anyone remember what it was like before AC? Wasn't that nice? Every time I feel the cool breeze, I give thanks for LaVon, right? So
We have 2 more slides.
okay. Okay, so this is not an endorsement in any way, shape, or form. I'm just acknowledging that one of the decisions that sometimes has to get made is what mortuary are you going to use? It's not, it can feel like a somber decision, and I recognize that. I know there is a mortuary.
There are some interesting names of funeral homes, especially in San Diego. Oh gosh. Yeah. I know we've got Good Body here. There's also Bravo. So,
Pastor Manuel has more
But-
experience because you lived here longer, but do you
Yeah.
want to share about any of those?
no, I mean, they're Feather and Gill is the one we work with the most here at St. Andrews. And they've been really, really good, really good. So Good Body as well. And then Greenwood, which is not listed up there, has been working with them as well. We have several members who are, in fact, that was the first memorial service and graveside that I did was at Greenwood. And it was, we went to the Jewish mausoleum there for that service, so. it
One
was-
of the other decisions that it can help to have some advanced care directives on, and this maybe has been discussed other times, is will you be cremated or not? That makes a difference in the
That was-
expense of the funerals.
It was nearly unheard of like 30 years ago. Now it's really, really common.
Most of the
So-
time, people are cremated anymore.
Yeah, and it's a really nice thing too, like with my sister, we had her remains separated into 4 little boxes inside the urn, and so we each got a box, and she has one little box, it's in a cemetery in Sonora. Another box that I took up to the top of a mountain above Lake Tahoe and spread out there. And so another box that the kids have in Minnesota, and her husband has a box too. So it's something to be requested of. With that as well, a lot of people, particularly here in San Diego, want some kind of burial at sea where they take the ashes out. That is costly, but it can be done.
It does need to
So-
be arranged for in advance. You can't just take a dinghy boat out there and dump the ashes. There's rules about it. So, they, most of the time they don't. You know, and then there's been newer decisions that people are making, like donating their body to science, or some people are interested in composting their body, there's,
Joe did a good job talking about.
yeah, good, yeah, those are personal decisions. It helps us to know, for coordination purposes, what the plans are. Will there be the remains of this person in our buildings at some point? That helps us to know, or not. I would say it's about half and half
Yeah,
anymore. A lot of times we'll do a memorial service and there's just the picture. That's fine too. It's okay. There's no one way to do it, right? And then of course, making decisions about burial sites. If the person has any, that's meant to be military on the bottom, any military association, again, there's a lot of people in San Diego that do. You might be able to have your loved one or yourself interned at one of our sites up in Mira Mesa or at Fort Rosecrans. And that has its own process too, where you work with the military representatives to do military honors and things like that. Yeah.
And almost all the pictures will will by burial, military burial. Talk about that in classes.
oh, good.
Good. And we have our services here for the celebration of life or memorial or funeral here, but then there's also graveside services that sometimes are done separately. Or
Mhm.
sometimes there's just the graveside, and that's fine too, right? So there's
Yeah.
some things like that.
And with the military services too, they are strict about time. You gotta be there on time. You have a short amount of time out there. And when it's done, you're gone. You can come back later in the afternoon and see where your loved one's been placed. That's it. And they're quick. So. All right, grief support. It's our last slide.
Okay.
Right on time.
So, I would encourage you all, you can come on in, we're just finishing up. I would encourage you all to, if you have been through an experience of grief, to try to make sure you check out at least some sort of support for yourself. It's a hard thing to go through on your own. And so most hospices and hospitals do provide support groups. And sometimes you can get involved in these before your loved one even dies, as a caregiver, right? Then we have a grief group that's kind of met as needed over the years. Our curriculum has changed over time. I just this last year did a new a grief curriculum that I think we're going to continue to use. And that being a part of the St. Andrew's grief groups, it doesn't matter if your loved one died this year or 20 years ago. It can still be a meaningful thing to have a space where you can talk about grief. It's just not something that we are comfortable with as a society often talking about. And I find that most people just carry their grief very quietly internally, and it can feel lonely. And so to try to provide some places where you can talk about it is important. And then, you know, making sure if you feel like you have a complicated grieving process, to ask us or someone else about what kind of therapeutic support may be available. And grieving periods, just to throw the promo back at our Stephen ministers, is a great time to make use of our Stephen ministry. Our Stephen ministers are trained to support people in a more accompanying alongside way through times like that. Yeah.
Also.
Yeah.
Appreciated.
And that's a ministry of our Stephen ministers as well. Our grief books are great resources. Yeah.
Mhm.
I just wanted to point out, the student ministers do not provide group support, you have one-on-one.
Yes.
Yes. And you kind of identify ahead of time with the Stephen minister why you're asking for a Stephen minister. So that person, you know, the two of you enter into that confidential relationship, aware of what's bringing you to that place of needing that care and support. And it's a good thing. You don't have to go through any of it alone. Again, there's parts of that, the service itself, memorial service itself, making the decisions around it, is a part of the healing process. But it certainly doesn't end the grieving process, right? So I wanted to make sure to acknowledge ways that you can get additional support. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Yes, we can email out the form and the link to the article and the TED Talk that Larry sent. We can get that sent out to you all.
Okay, make sure on your feedback form, to list your name and your email address so that we can pass it on to them.
So yes, Lydia.
So you still have a file in the church that contains all this? Pastor Phil used to call it the frog file.
Frog?
Yeah.
Okay.
People-
Some people have provided us with this stuff in advance, like Barbara DeVersa gave us a file. When I die, this is what I want, right? And we can keep that stuff on file in church if you want. I'm finding that more and more, that's less and less common. More and more people have a file at home or give a file to a loved one, but you can keep that stuff here too, as well. I don't know if we still call it the frog file.
That's the first time I've heard that. I like it.
That's funny. I did not know. I know that there's a drawer in the senior pastor's desk. That's all I know.
There is.
The frog drawer apparently.